These are 8 performances that defined how movies portray educators, from Robin Williams standing on desks to J.K. Simmons throwing chairs. The teacher on screen serves as more than an instructor, becoming an agent of disruption, a catalyst for transformation, and sometimes a terrifying figure of perfectionism. What follows examines the actors who brought cinema's most memorable educators to life and the films that turned classroom drama into box office gold. John Keating, Dead Poets Society. Robin Williams transformed the teacher archetype when he played John Keating in Dead Poets Society, and the 1989 film cast him as an English teacher returning to the fictional Welton Academy, an all-male preparatory school in Vermont. Australian director Peter Weir chose Williams, known primarily for manic improvisational comedy in films like Good Morning Vietnam, to bring subdued dramatic gravity to the role, which meant audiences were about to see him in a completely different light. Keating's teaching philosophy stood in direct opposition to Welton's rigid 4 pillars of tradition, honor, discipline, and excellence, and his methodology was performative and visceral. In one memorable scene, he instructed students to rip pages from their textbooks that attempted to graph poetry's greatness mathematically through the fictional Pritchard scale, arguing that art is not a metric to be measured but a human experience to be felt. His emphasis on individualism, nonconformity, and seizing the moment through his famous Carpe Diem philosophy became the beating heart of the film. Williams brought his improvisational genius to controlled moments throughout production, and the scene where Keating impersonates Marlon Brando and John Wayne performing Shakespeare was entirely improvised.
No, with Shakespeare can be different. Friends, Romans, countrymen. Let me rest.
Director Peter Weir famously had to hide the raw footage of Williams's more comedic takes from Disney executives, fearing they would misunderstand the film's dramatic tone or demand a purely comedic cut, which would have destroyed what Weir was building. Production filmed on location at St. Andrew's School in Middletown, Delaware, from November 14, 1988 to January 15, 1989, and the Gothic Revival architecture provided the authentic, oppressive atmosphere necessary to establish Welton's suffocating tradition. Tom Schulman's script drew heavily on Walt Whitman's work, with Keating frequently called, "Oh Captain, my Captain," in reference to Whitman's elegy for Abraham Lincoln, reinforcing Keating as a leader, guiding students through the perilous voyage of adolescence. Dead Poets Society defied conventional wisdom that dramas about poetry couldn't achieve blockbuster success, and the numbers proved the doubters wrong. Produced on a budget of $16.4 million, the film opened in limited release on June 2, 1989 in just 8 theaters, generating $340,456 before expanding wide on June 9. What nobody expected was the film's incredible endurance, still ranking number 11 at the box office in its 10th week of release, and pulling in over $3.1 million nearly 3 months after opening. The worldwide gross reached $235,860,116, with $95,860,116 coming from domestic audiences and $140 million from international markets, which meant the film earned approximately 14 times its production budget. Touchstone Pictures had taken a gamble on the unconventional project, and that gamble paid off spectacularly. Williams received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, while the film earned 4 Oscar nominations total, including Best Picture and Best Director for Weir. Tom Schulman won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, and the film won Best Film at the BAFTA Awards in the UK and Best Foreign Film at both the César Awards in France and the David Di Donatello Awards in Italy. In 2006, the American Film Institute ranked it number 52 on its 100 Years 100 Cheers list of most inspiring films. The character proved so iconic that decades later, the story was adapted for the stage, with a play adapted by Schulman and directed by John Doyle, premiering off-Broadway at the Classic Stage Company in October 2016, featuring Jason Sudeikis stepping into the formidable shadow Williams had cast. Joe Clark, Lean on Me. Morgan Freeman delivered one of cinema's most controversial educator performances as Joe Clark in Lean on Me, and the film, released in 1989, the same year as Dead Poets Society, presented a starkly different vision of American education. Freeman portrayed the real-life principal of East Side High School in Paterson, New Jersey, a school facing catastrophic failure with rampant drug problems, violence, and abysmal test scores that threatened state receivership. Clark embodied what could be called pragmatic authoritarianism, and as a former Army drill instructor, he believed learning was impossible in an environment of fear, which meant order must be established by any means necessary before education could begin. Freeman's Clark roamed hallways with a bullhorn and baseball bat, expelled 300 students, identified as drug dealers and abusers in a single assembly, and governed through intimidation and sheer force of will.
Now I say, if you want to kill yourself, don't fuck around with it. Go in and do it expeditiously. Now go in and jump! Jump!
The film's most dramatic moments were grounded in reality, and that's what made them so powerful. The real Joe Clark did carry a baseball bat while patrolling hallways as a symbol of authority, and he famously chained the school doors shut to prevent drug dealers from entering, even though doing so was a direct violation of fire codes that led to legal battles. Clark did expel approximately 300 students whom he deemed detrimental to the learning environment, arguing he had to save the students who wanted to learn, though some scenes were dramatized for emotional effect, including the choir scene where students win over the school board. Produced on a budget of $10 million, Lean on Me opened on March 3, 1989, with a weekend gross of over $5 million, and ultimately grossed $31.9 million domestically. Critics offered mixed reviews, but audiences embraced the film with a rare A+ cinema score rating that indicated immense viewer satisfaction. Roger Ebert gave a nuanced critique that praised Freeman's powerful performance, while criticizing the film's moral stance, arguing it celebrated a benevolent dictator who was a grown-up example of the very troublemakers he hates so much because he demanded adherence to rules while flagrantly breaking them himself. The film sparked debate regarding the great man theory of education and the ethics of Clark's methods, aligning with the tough-on-crime and personal responsibility rhetoric of the late 1980s. Former Secretary of Education William Bennett praised the real Joe Clark with words that captured the era's philosophy. Sometimes you need Mr. Chips and sometimes you need Dirty Harry. Freeman's performance won him an NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Motion Picture, and the real Joe Clark, who passed away in 2020, worked as director of a juvenile detention center in Newark, New Jersey, from 1995 to 2002, after leaving Eastside High in 1989. The film's title references the 1972 Bill Withers song Lean on Me, which is featured prominently throughout the movie and became inseparable from the story Clark's life told. Mr. Holland's opus. Richard Dreyfuss portrayed Glenn Holland in Mr. Holland's opus as what could be called the reluctant mentor archetype, and unlike Keating or Clark who entered teaching with burning missions, Holland viewed teaching as temporary failure, just a gig to pay rent while he composed his American Symphony. The 1995 film, spanning 30 years from 1965 to 1995, deconstructed the notion of ambition and explored how true legacy is measured. Holland's character arc centered on acceptance, slowly realizing his true legacy was not the symphony he wrote on paper but the thousands of minds he shaped in the classroom. The narrative was complicated by his relationship with his son Cole, who was born deaf, and this irony of a musician father unable to share his language with his son provided the film's emotional core while forcing Holland to learn that communication transcends sound. Hollywood Pictures, a Disney label, produced the film with a budget of $31 million, and the fictional John F. Kennedy High School was filmed in Portland, Oregon. The American Symphony that Holland labored over for decades was actually composed by Michael Kamen, who also wrote the film's score that critics widely regard as one of his best works. Dreyfuss underwent rigorous training to portray a music teacher convincingly, learning to conduct and play piano for the role, and while some classical music purists critiqued his conducting technique, the emotional authenticity of the performance was widely praised. The production committed to authentic representation for deaf characters, casting Joseph Anderson at age 15 and Anthony Natali as an adult to play Holland's son Cole, both of whom were hard of hearing or deaf in real life. And actress Glenn Headley, who played Iris Holland, learned American Sign Language to communicate with them on and off screen. Mr. Holland's opus performed exceptionally well as a sleeper hit, and the 2.5-hour character drama grossed $82,569,971 domestically and $106.3 million worldwide. Opening in limited release on December 29, 1995 to qualify for awards before expanding wide in January 1996, the film holds a 74% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Dreyfuss received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor and a Golden Globe nomination for his performance, with critics often comparing the film to Goodbye Mr. Chips from 1939 and noting its similar structure of following a single teacher through decades of social change. The most remarkable legacy came from the real-world organization the film spawned, and that's when composer Michael Kamen founded the Mr. Holland's Opus Foundation in 1996. As of 2025, the foundation has donated over 41,000 instruments valued at more than $37 million to approximately 2,000 schools across 49 states, impacting over 500,000 students, while donating over $3.3 million to schools hit by hurricanes and wildfires, maintaining a 4-star rating on Charity Navigator. The film's most memorable quote came from the finale.
"We are your symphony, Mr. Holland. We are the melodies and the notes of your opus."
We are your symphony, Mr. Holland. We are the melodies and the notes of your opus. Professor Maurice Phipps, Higher Learning. Laurence Fishburne brought intellectual gravitas to Professor Maurice Phipps in John Singleton's 1995 ensemble drama Higher Learning, playing a political science professor at the fictional Columbus University who represented what could be called the intellectual realist archetype. Fishburne adopted a distinct West Indian accent specifically for the role to convey academic authority, and his character challenged students while refusing to coddle them and pushing them toward critical thinking. Phipps took aim particularly at protagonist Malik Williams, played by Omar Epps, a track star on partial scholarship, refusing to let Malik use systemic racism as an excuse for intellectual laziness. While acknowledging that structural racism exists, Phipps argued that using it as a crutch breeds laziness, pushing students to take personal responsibility for their intellect and define their own ideologies, rather than succumbing to peer pressure or societal expectations.
We play to win, because in the real world, no one wants to hear excuses or empty rhetoric, no.
Released in January 1995, Higher Learning arrived in a highly charged atmosphere following the 1992 Los Angeles riots and during the O.J. Simpson trial, and Singleton used the university campus as a microcosm for America's racial and social tensions. Phipps's pedagogy centered on unlearning prejudices and assumptions, famously quoting Frederick Douglass with words that served as the film's thematic spine: "Without struggle there is no progress." That quote was juxtaposed ironically against white supremacist characters who read Hitler's Mein Kampf, which translates to "my struggle." The ensemble cast included Ice Cube as Fudge, a professional student and political radical, Michael Rappaport as Remy, a lonely student radicalized by neo-Nazis, and Tyra Banks in her theatrical film debut. Exterior scenes of Columbus University were filmed at the University of California, Los Angeles, while interiors were shot at Sony Pictures Studios. The film performed solidly at the box office, opening at number 2 with $13.3 million and eventually grossing $38.3 million domestically, though critical reception was mixed with a 48% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Critics praised Fishburne's commanding performance but felt Singleton's script was often heavy-handed and melodramatic, and Roger Ebert gave a thoughtful review, noting the film raised difficult questions about whether prejudice can truly be unlearned. Fishburne won the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Motion Picture for his performance, and the film explored themes of campus shootings and radicalization that became tragically more relevant in the decades following its release, giving it an unsettling prescience. Phipps represented a middle ground in the spectrum of cinematic educators, neither a warm facilitator nor a harsh authoritarian, but rigorous and often cold, believing the world is harsh and the kindest thing a teacher can do is prepare students for that harshness without coddling them. His approach emphasized personal accountability within the context of systemic inequality, making him one of the more complex educator figures in cinema. Paul Hunham, The Holdovers. Paul Giamatti delivered a career-defining performance as Paul Hunham in The Holdovers, playing a classics teacher at Barton Academy, an elite New England boarding school in 1970 who embodied the classical curmudgeon archetype. Hunham was a man out of time, rigid, acerbic, and universally disliked by both students and faculty, viewing his role not as a friend to students but as a gatekeeper of civilization who refused to pass wealthy but dim-witted children of donors. Hunham was physically distinct, suffering from trimethylaminaria, a condition causing a fishy body odor, and a pronounced lazy eye called strabismus, and these traits isolated him while creating a defensive shell of intellect and sarcasm. The film followed his thawing during a Christmas break, where he was forced to chaperone a holdover student named Angus Tully. Director Alexander Payne and cinematographer Eigil Brild crafted the 2023 film to look and feel as if it were actually made in 1970, featuring a mono-sound mix, vintage studio title cards, and digitally added film grain to replicate the texture of 70s cinema. Filming took place entirely in Massachusetts during winter 2022 to capture authentic New England cold. The most discussed technical aspect was Giamatti's wandering eye, which was not CGI but rather a custom-made opaque hand-painted contact lens that effectively blinded him in one eye during filming. This affected his depth perception and added genuine physical awkwardness to his performance, demonstrating remarkable commitment to the role. Produced for $13 million, The Holdovers grossed $45.8 million worldwide, making it a remarkable success for a quiet, character-driven dramedy, and the film became a major awards contender. Da'Vine Joy Randolph swept the awards season, winning the Oscar, Golden Globe, and BAFTA for Best Supporting Actress for her role as Mary Lamb, while Giamatti won the Golden Globe for Best Actor in Musical or Comedy and received an Oscar nomination. But here's where it gets complicated, because in March 2024, The Holdovers became embroiled in a high-profile plagiarism scandal. Screenwriter Simon Stevenson, writer of Luca and Paddington 2, accused director Alexander Payne and screenwriter David Hemmingson of plagiarizing his unproduced 2013 Blacklist script called Frisco, alleging the scripts shared line-by-line similarities in dialogue and identical structural beats about a cynical, middle-aged man forced to care for a 15-year-old. Stevenson provided evidence that Payne had been sent Frisco in 2013 and had read it twice before passing on it. The Writers Guild of America declined to arbitrate the dispute based on a technicality, because Frisco was written on spec, meaning it was not commissioned or employed by a studio at the time of writing. and the WGA generally does not arbitrate plagiarism claims for spec scripts. This left Stevenson with the option of a lawsuit which has not been pursued to date, and Payne dismissed the claims by stating the film was inspired by a 1935 French film called Merluce, which shares a similar premise of a hated teacher watching students over a holiday. Despite the controversy, The Holdovers remains critically acclaimed, featuring memorable dialogue including Hunham's quote, "There's nothing new in human experience, Mr. Tully. History is not simply the study of the past, it is an explanation of the present." Yoda, The Empire Strikes Back. Frank Oz created one of cinema's most iconic teachers through his puppetry and voice work as Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back, and the character released in 1980 represented the archetype of the wise old man, or spiritual master. A 900-year-old Jedi Master living in exile on the swamp planet Dagobah, Yoda was unique on this list as he taught metaphysics of existence through the Force rather than an academic subject. Yoda's pedagogy was Zen-like and deconstructionist, forcing his student Luke Skywalker to unlearn preconceptions about size, power, and reality through riddles, physical tasks, and frustration designed to break down Luke's ego. He famously rejected the concept of trying, viewing it as a lack of commitment through his iconic line,
"Do or do not. There is no try."
Yoda is considered one of the greatest achievements in practical effects history, and the character was designed by Stuart Freeman, who based Yoda's face on a combination of his own face and Albert Einstein. The inclusion of Einstein's features, specifically the eyes and wrinkles, was a deliberate choice to subconsciously signal intelligence and wisdom to the audience. The puppetry operation was physically grueling for Frank Oz, who performed Yoda while the set was built on a raised platform that allowed Oz to work from a trench beneath the floorboards. He held the heavy puppet above his head for hours at a time while operating the mouth in one hand, and assistants Catherine Mullen and Wendy Froud operated the other hand, ears, and eyes via cables. Oz also provided the voice, creating the character's iconic object-subject-verb syntax that became instantly recognizable. The creation of Yoda and the difficult shoot on Dagobah contributed to massive budget overruns, and what started as an $18 million budget soared to over $30.5 million, with some sources claiming $33 million. George Lucas financed the film independently using his earnings from Star Wars, risking his entire fortune on the production, and the complexity of the Yoda sequences was a major factor in these costs. The gamble paid off spectacularly when the film grossed $209 million domestically in its initial run and reached a lifetime worldwide gross of over $538 million. The commercial success validated Lucas's risk and established Yoda as one of the most beloved characters in cinema history. Yoda's teaching philosophy produced some of cinema's most quotable lines. And beyond, "do or do not, there is no try," he offered profound statements like, "Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter," and "wars not make one great." These aphorisms transcended the Star Wars franchise and entered popular culture as genuine philosophical observations. The character's impact on the teacher archetype cannot be overstated, proving that mentors need not be young or physically imposing to be compelling. His ancient wisdom, patient instruction despite frustration, and ultimate faith in his students' potential created a template for spiritual mentors in cinema that continues influencing films today. Terence Fletcher, Whiplash. J.K. Simmons created one of cinema's most terrifying educators as Terence Fletcher in Whiplash, and the 2014 film presented Fletcher as a jazz conductor at the prestigious, fictional Schaefer Conservatory who operated on a philosophy of abusive perfectionism. Fletcher believed the two most harmful words in the English language are "good job" because they encourage mediocrity, and his stated goal was to find the next Charlie Parker. Fletcher's methods for achieving that goal involved psychological gaslighting, homophobic and misogynistic verbal abuse, and physical assault, including throwing chairs at students, representing the terrifying extreme of the tough love spectrum while raising the question of whether artistic greatness is worth the cost of one's humanity. Fletcher's teaching style faced heavy criticism from the jazz community, and critics and musicians noted the film portrayed jazz drumming as a macho athletic endeavor focusing on speed measured in beats per minute and bleeding hands rather than the improvisation, swing, and feeling that actually defined the genre. The film treated music more like a sport than an art form. Fletcher justified his abuse by citing a story where Joe Jones threw a cymbal at Charlie Parker, which allegedly drove Parker to practice and become Bird. And this formed the core tenet of his philosophy that trauma produces genius. The film explored whether this belief system had any validity or whether it simply rationalized cruelty. Whiplash exemplified high-efficiency filmmaking, produced on a micro-budget of $3.3 million while grossing $49 million worldwide and yielding a massive return on investment. The physical toll on actor Miles Teller, who played Andrew, was real because Teller played drums himself in many scenes and suffered from exhaustion and genuine blisters that mirrored his character's struggle. Simmons's terrifying performance swept the awards season, winning the Academy Award, Golden Globe, and BAFTA for Best Supporting Actor, and the performance was so commanding that it redefined Simmons's career and became the standard against which intimidating authority figures in film are measured.
There are no two words in the English language more harmful than good job.
Another iconic line was his repeated phrase, "Not quite my tempo," as he psychologically tortured Andrew during rehearsals, and Fletcher's closing statement attempted to justify his methods. "I was there to push people beyond what's expected of them. I believe that's an absolute necessity." The film's ending remains controversial, because after Andrew's triumphant final performance, it's unclear whether the movie endorses Fletcher's methods or critiques them. This ambiguity sparked intense debate about whether the film romanticizes abuse or presents a cautionary tale about the cost of perfectionism. Whiplash stands as a stark counterpoint to the warm mentors like Keating or Holland, asking whether greatness requires suffering and whether teachers who inflict pain can be justified if they produce exceptional results. The film refused to provide easy answers, leaving audiences to grapple with uncomfortable questions about excellence and humanity. Erin Gruwell, Freedom Writers. Hilary Swank portrayed Erin Gruwell in Freedom Writers, based on the real-life teacher at Woodrow Wilson Classical High School in Long Beach, California, who was assigned to a class of at-risk students deemed unteachable by administration. Gruwell adopted the role of empathetic facilitator, and unlike authoritarian Joe Clark, she sought to bridge racial and gang divides in her classroom through validation rather than intimidation. Gruwell used journaling to allow students to tell their own stories, famously compiling these entries into the Freedom Writer's Diary, and her curriculum connected their experiences with gang violence to the Holocaust by using the Diary of Anne Frank and Zlata's diary as foundational texts. This approach helps students see their struggles within a broader historical context of survival and resistance. The 2007 film was noted for its adherence to real events described in Gruwell's book, and the voiceovers in the film were taken verbatim from actual student diaries. The Toast for Change scene, where students drank apple cider from plastic champagne flutes and vowed to restart their lives, was a reenactment of a real event, and the film featured real Holocaust survivors interacting with students while blurring the line between narrative film and documentary. Tragedy struck during production when the film became dedicated to the memory of Armand Jones, an 18-year-old actor in the film, who was fatally shot in Anaheim after a confrontation at a Denny's restaurant shortly after filming concluded. This real-life violence underscored the very themes the film attempted to address, adding somber weight to the finished product. Produced on a budget of $21 million, Freedom Writers opened on January 5, 2007 and grossed $36.6 million domestically and $43.1 million worldwide, making it a moderate commercial success. While the film found an audience, Freedom Writers faced retrospective criticism regarding the white savior trope, and critics argued the film centered a white protagonist as the primary agent of salvation for students of color, while implicitly suggesting they cannot save themselves without white intervention. The film was criticized for simplifying complex structural issues into individual triumphs enabled by a white authority figure. Defenders of the film, including the real Erin Gruwell, argued the story is biographical and factual, contending Gruwell's role was not to save students, but to provide them tools, specifically writing, to save themselves. The film explicitly showed Gruwell learning from students rather than just dictating to them, attempting to create a more reciprocal relationship than typical savior narratives. The real Erin Gruwell left classroom teaching to establish the Freedom Writers Foundation and continues to travel, speak, and train educators in her methodology while keeping the legacy of the Freedom Writers alive. Her approach emphasized the power of storytelling and writing as tools for processing trauma and building empathy across cultural divides. Freedom Writers represented the empathetic end of the teacher spectrum, and where Fletcher used abuse and Clark used authority, Gruwell used validation and connection. Her methods raised different questions about effectiveness and sustainability, asking whether empathy alone can overcome systemic inequality and whether validation is sufficient without structural change, though the film suggested these questions matter less than the immediate impact on individual lives. Loved exploring these characters with me? Then you'll be obsessed with the next video on your screen, so click on it and dive in.